we have to talk about consciousness. Our life is actually a midpoint between the two deaths. To use the sexual energy in order to achieve enlightenment. The three-dimensional spiral shape encoded in our DNA, in our biology.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast. Oh, I think I was still playing a little bit with my levels, so let me know if it's clipping out, but I hope you can hear me okay. Hey! Zidika Redirect. Wow. Great to have you here, although the name is troubling. But very, very happy to see you. Second week running, man. I'll catch me up after the show if you wanna talk. But it's great to see you here on the live show. It's not easy getting listeners who don't have Discord to join into the live show. I've been mentioning it to people, but it's like it very, very nice to have people who use Discord and who know about it, and to see some recurring faces like Alien Honey. Hiya, great to see you as well. Oh, good, thanks, Rondon. And Krim. Thank you very much for the offer, and great to have you here as usual. I'm and Foxquote, you're on the website. It's always tough to see because I only see who's in chat. But great to have you here from afar, and I'm glad you can join us. Yeah, I gotta tell you, I was just saying to Rondon and Krim that I really want to step up my streaming overlay, especially for the video watchers out there. Not to forget you. I've been meaning to just get a background image as opposed to this just very ordinary one that I've found. I just haven't been able to get around to it. It's been a really crazy busy time. How have you been? Like, do you notice that this has been a very, very intense period of time? Or is it just me? I'm curious to know. Sometimes these things have a sort of a wave. You feel that it's really global, and a lot of people go through sort of the same periods and feelings. So I'm just curious. For me, it's crazy busy. All very good things, and for those who know, we've been getting a lot of work done on the land, moving forward, and we actually have a company that we're working with that is also stepping into high gear. So there's a lot of interesting things, but it takes up a lot of time. So at the very least, I'm glad I can get to these weekly episodes. And all around, I think it's been not just for me. So I'm glad to hear, and I hope you'll understand. Thanks to that, but I do promise to do it, and I hope Krim will agree to lend me some of her wisdom to improve the overlay a bit and make it a more enjoyable and entertaining experience for you, because that's really what it's all about in the end. So yeah, great to be here for another episode. I hope you enjoyed the last two. They were a little bit of a break and sort of discussion. And today we're actually going to carry on with the narrative a little bit. We'll have a quick recap because it's been a while. And although we sort of mentioned in the last couple of episodes, but it's good to sort of remind ourselves where we are. So within the story of Atlantis, the Martians have just completed constructing the synthetic Merkaba that they were using to sort of gain control and influence on the planet. And it goes horribly wrong and really cataclysmic in its effect, an interdimensional crisis that alerts many, many different beings as well. And as we mentioned, the Nacals, the Lemurians basically, who are of this higher level, were out of their depth and really didn't know what to do in order to rectify the situation, to fix things. And so they decided to turn to sort of the higher beings, what Drunvalo calls the Galactic Command, and to ask them for help, to pray for guidance and for assistance. Vaccines cause avian flu, great to have you here as well. Glad to see you in chat. And so the Galactic Command, who was already sort of aware of what was happening on Earth, and this was a sort of universal or more than just a global event, And we're sort of thinking of what the solution to that problem could be. Now, the solution itself is a little bit complex, but it ties into a lot of different things that we've talked about and already mentioned. And so what they were suggesting was to create what they called a planetary grid. And in order to understand what this is, we'll touch on a few topics that we've already spoken about in the past. And so we mentioned the Schumann resonance, which is the sort of resonance of planet Earth, an electromagnetic pulse that comes from the magnetic sphere, electromagnetic sphere that rotates around the Earth. And so this electromagnetic pulse is a certain representation of this phenomenon, of this sort of grid that's enveloping the planet and sort of protecting it to a certain degree from some things. And so, what they were planning on doing, and the idea behind it, is to create a planetary grid that will be tied into the human consciousness. And so, yeah. And, well, you'll be able to listen live afterwards anyway, if you miss anything important. So, this idea is basically one that, according to Drunvalo, exists already. And so every species on planet Earth, in order for it to exist, has this consciousness grid that is tying all of them, the species, in together. And in Drunvalo's description, I thought it'd be worth mentioning, he says that it's an ethereal crystalline structure. So we actually mentioned the term ethereal in the last episode, and we can see the representation here that it's of a higher frequency, of a higher dimension, that it exists in a non-physical way. And the crystalline structure pertains to the sort of shape which this grid around the Earth was made up of, these squares and triangles, these hard shapes, that gave it the appearance of sort of the same way that crystals grow, and assorted, the molecules all fitting together in a very specific and very rigid structure. And this grid that enveloped the Earth, there were obviously grids around for human beings because we were one of these species. But the grids that were around at the time were of different levels of consciousness. And so if you'll recall, is that a question for me, Foxcoid? Is what safe? The grid. Let me know what the question is. If I can't remember when it was, but a few episodes back, we spoke about different levels of consciousness and the different ways of viewing the world, the binary level of consciousness that we're in now, and the first level of consciousness, which Drunvalo mentions as being sort of the primal state, a level where we can see sort of the tribal beings with much less individuality, much less separation of the I from the surrounding, and really viewing the world as one cohesive unity. And so these are the two levels of consciousness that we mentioned. As we talked about it, the problem is that this second level of consciousness is a rather destructive and can be very, very harmful if it's not exited in time, if, as it were, you stay in that level for too long. It has a tendency for self-destruction. And so this was the idea that they had behind the planetary grid, to create this planetary grid is sort of a natural part that evolves out of consciousness. And the idea was, instead of having the natural route, if they were to allow the natural evolution of human beings, of our consciousness, it would take too long. And because of this catastrophe with the synthetic Merkaba, they had to speed the process up artificially. And so they decided to create the next planetary grid, the next level of consciousness, and that way to sort of help elevate the human species into it. And this other planetary grid was adjacent to the third level of consciousness, parallel, an example of the third level of consciousness. And if you remember when we spoke about it, one of the terms that Drunvalo keeps referring to is Christ consciousness. It's a consciousness that can be seen as similar to the primal consciousness because it too sees things as a unity, But unlike the primal first level, in this state, it's after unifying the two opposites. It's after seeing the separation in the world and then coming back to a unified theory, a unified perspective, seeing all of the different parts and still sort of seeing both levels at the same time. And so that was the level of consciousness that the grid was representing and was there to basically elevate and bring about. Now, the thing about these grids, and Drunvalo talks about this quite a lot, that I won't go too much into it because it's a subject in and of itself, but he mentions quite a few times that the governments, the US government and the Russian government, back in the 1960s, became very, very interested in this consciousness grid and sort of began to study and to discover that this grid existed, and that with it they could win a certain influence and seize power over planet Earth in general. And so this idea is one that we've also mentioned before. One of the points that Drunvalo brings as proof is that if you look around the world at all the military bases that the US and Russia started building in the 1960s and 70s, you see them being placed in rather remote and not necessarily strategic, rather unusual locations. And these locations actually seem to correlate very much to the nodal points of focus of the consciousness grid. And so if you'll remember, we mentioned before the term ley lines. And ley lines mean these sort of energetic lines that are sort of going through the Earth. Now, the consciousness grid is not the actual ley lines. The ley lines themselves are part of the Earth, of the planet itself. And even if there were no humans and no animals, no species, these ley lines would still exist as part of planet Earth, however much they would be different. So, yeah. With the Christ consciousness, that's specifically for human beings of sort of the third level of dimension. And so that's something that wouldn't exist without human beings, as it were. Although it's synthetically created here, it wouldn't really have a function, as it were. But, and this is sort of more my take on things, it seems that there is a distinct correlation between the ley lines and the consciousness grid, the sort of energy patterns, because again, they're both energetic or ethereal grids that envelop the Earth with different functions and different frequencies, but both of them are actually multi-dimensional at the same time. And so with the ley lines, when they are pulsating, this energy is going through, it's not only going to give a read on an electromagnetic or electromagnetic radiation frequency reader, but also in higher dimensional levels where the vibration is too high for third dimensional representation, it exists on these other dimensions as well. So these ley lines are sort of in the same way that when we spoke about human beings and the different bodies that we have, the ethereal body, the mental body, the spiritual body, the Earth also exists in many different dimensions, and the ley lines pulsate through these different dimensions. And the same thing is true with the Christ consciousness grid. It exists on many of these different levels, and so there's the third dimensional representation of it with the electromagnetic spectrum, but it also exists on the higher dimensions as well. And so there's this correlation, not that they have the same function, but that they seem to be on certain nodal points connected. And this would make sense if we imagine the Christ consciousness grid of humans. It is interacting with planet Earth. It sort of, for lack of a better word, it plugs into the Earth's own energetic fields. And the two of these sort of combine. The Christ consciousness is also a part of the Earth, and its structure would be different on a different planet. So although I want to make sure that we're as clear as can be that these are two separate grids with different functions, the ley lines and the Christ consciousness, but the locations where they sort of interact with the surface where we are or if we're talking about sacred buildings, old monuments that were built in these specific places and seem to be on these nodes, on these important energy intersections, a lot of the times those locations will correlate between the Christ consciousness structure and the ley lines of Earth. But having said all that, what Drunvalo is talking about here is specifically about the Christ consciousness nodal points, and the US and Russian armies building these military bases all around the globe on these strategic points, the ones that are important in terms of the energy mapping out and the grid itself. Oh, Revised Sociology, great to have you here as well. Thank you for joining. Okay, so what does all this mean for us? Obviously, according to Drunvalo, the grid was actually completed and sort of fully functional in 1989, which was a long, long time after the Atlantean story and where we're talking about in terms of the timeline, and today, many, many years ago. And it's an interesting thing. I purposely don't often mention dates and years because I think that they are sort of, first of all, very, very few people who have given exact dates have been correct. And I think when it comes to talking about any kind of premonitions or predictions that are made, it's a very problematic field of study. I think that there's much more accuracy, and indeed there's much more beneficial information in recognizing sort of the waves that come and the different cycles that seem to be around in a natural. And if you can predict those cycles, then there is some ability to see what's coming, as opposed to specific dates. Drunvalo is very keen on dates, and he gives a lot of those numbers, and I'll be completely honest and open because I don't want to hide any information. I mean, it depends on who you believe and how you see it, but it could be stated that a lot of those dates that he gave were incorrect. And indeed, in the book, in a few paragraphs, he corrects himself and sort of updates it. This is a newer edition that came out later, and updates certain facts and figures according to the thing. Now, I do want to just mention very quickly before we move on that I don't see any problem, with people making mistakes. And I think it's clear that I make mistakes, and the people I'm talking about made mistakes, and I've yet to find someone infallible completely, and that's okay. It's important to recognize, I think, when mistakes are made more than trying to prevent them completely. And when it comes to even the way that Drunvalo sees things, reality itself is not completely set in stone. It's not something that if you could sort of measure all the factors, you could predict exactly molecule by molecule what would happen. It's something that's created and indeed is capable of change. It's obviously it's based on probability. You can say what's probably going to happen, and that's what we do in our life all the time. But then always there are these instances of something happening that was completely a very, very small chance, and yet it happened nonetheless. And so this is all a very roundabout way of saying that when he mentions these dates and these things, if you read through the book, you'll see that a lot of them, I'm not sure we would agree that they happened as he predicted, although he talks about 2012. Well, let's talk about 2012 very quickly, because that's, I think, a very good example. I believe we've mentioned it before, right, with the equinoxes, I think in one of the episodes. But 2012, everyone was very fearful about the fact that the world was going to end, that it was going to be the apocalypse, and I'm not really sure what people thought was going to happen. But it seemed, and certainly for the skeptics, that nothing happened. The day, the 21st of December came and went, and the world seemed to have woken up and continued very much the same. But if you understand the way that the Mayans actually perceived the calendar, it wasn't a specific date that symbolized the change. It was the date that symbolized the beginning of the change and a beginning of this shift, a beginning of a new cycle. very few things can really happen overnight. Most things that happen, you sort of look back a few months and say, these are the seeds that sort of you could have seen if you'd known where it was going. And reality seems very much to grow slowly over time. I think we can definitely see a certain shift that has happened, let's say since 2012, not necessarily that specific year, but the world is certainly changing, it feels, on a global scale. So even though in 2012 it would seem that nothing has happened, and so anyone who's talked about 2012 as some kind of important date was simply mistaken, I think there is something to be said for viewing these dates as very general, not specific, and as sort of cycles and waves of things that are coming. Okay? So with that in mind, I would like to continue onto trying to understand this whole Christ consciousness grid, because I did have a bit of trouble reading about it first, hearing that according to Drunvalo in 1989, the consciousness grid that was supposed to elevate human beings into the third dimension was completed, and since then it doesn't seem to have completely worked. And I'm not here to say necessarily, one way or another, what being elevated into the third dimension actually means, whether we're all just, spread into a Jesus pose and elevated to the sky, or beamed up by aliens, or, just a big level complete and then starting with a new planet. I don't really care to sort of fantasize about those details. What I would like to know is what this consciousness grid could be, and if there's a way for us to relate to it, because I feel, and indeed Drunvalo mentions, that there is a way to look at it that will make it a bit more accessible. And in his book, he mentions the 100th monkey experiment, which I believe is a very, very famous experiment. If you've never heard of it, you're more than welcome to go and look it up. It's a completely legit experiment. And the outline is very, very simple. There was a certain group of monkeys on an island, one of the islands in Japan, and they taught them to wash the coconuts. I believe that's what it was. The coconuts would fall into the sand, and they taught some of them to take them to the river and to wash them. And so these monkeys on the island began to sort of teach each other. And then it actually wasn't the 100th monkey, obviously, because that's a very nice whole number. But once a certain threshold was crossed, all the monkeys began to wash the coconuts. And what was surprising was that all of the monkeys on neighboring islands began to wash the coconuts at the same time as well. And so it seems that this experiment proves that there was a certain transference of information within the species, not in a regular communicable way, not as we understand it in the third dimension, but something else was going on. And so there's two very interesting phenomena, I think, that are worth talking about when it comes to this experiment. First of all, this idea that there is a certain threshold. This concept is a very, very common concept in the natural world. You have a certain event or something that happens that has to repeat itself, as it were, a certain number of times. And once it repeats itself enough, it becomes established. In a way, this is how sort of memory works and learning. We do something new, and usually we don't do it very well. But if we repeat it on and on and on, it will change, and eventually it will click, and we'll be able to sort of do it properly. Viruses work in the same way. A virus enters a host and starts to multiply, but the virus doesn't attack while it's multiplying, because then it would be outnumbered. It sort of waits until it has a large enough number, and actually, interestingly, it does this by sort of measuring how often it meets another virus of the same kind, and when it meets another virus often enough, as it were, once that threshold is crossed and there's enough of them, then all at once they all start attacking the body. So this sort of idea of a certain threshold that has to be crossed before to trigger an event is one that makes a lot of sense to us. What monkey, as it were, does the information actually pass? And it would be hard, I think, to say exactly what number it is. 100th monkey sounds very good for us, but literally speaking, nature doesn't usually work in those nice rounded sort of decimal numbers. And the other thing, obviously, that's interesting about this is the transference of information. And there's another experiment that Drunvalo actually doesn't talk about, but it became very famous in the wonderful film, which I'm not sure if I've mentioned before, Waking Life. I think I have. If you haven't seen it or heard of it, then you're in for a treat. Have a look. It's a very interesting film. It's a lot of philosophical, interesting discussions. And in one of the scenes there, they talk about an experiment that was done using a crossword. And so people were asked to solve a crossword, and their results were measured. And then they were given a crossword a day early, and they were the other way around. There was a control group, and they solved the crossword, and then they were given the crossword, I think, the day after it had been published in the world. So all around the world, many people had already solved the crossword, and then the control group was measured again, their results, and they did markedly better. I believe that's the experiment. I actually tried to look it up, and it's tough to find any documentation. It seems that it wasn't actually publicized as an experiment. I'm not sure why. But nevertheless, it seems that this experiment points to a correlation, a connection between an individual's ability and access to information and the species as a whole. Another good example that Drunvalo mentions is with experiments and inventions. In many cases throughout history, two or more researchers or scientists seem to invent the exact same thing very close together, with only sort of a very short period of time in between, whether it's discoveries or whether it's inventions. This is something that seems to happen quite often to a statistically improbable amount of times. And so all of these things seem to be pointing to this idea that Drunvalo mentions of a planetary consciousness grid, a consciousness grid that connects all of human beings. And in fact, if we choose a different term for it, there is another great researcher whom I'm very much a fan of, who termed the coin the collective unconscious. And if you've never heard of this term, it was I believe, I might be mistaken now, but I believe it was coined by Jung. He definitely is one of the ones who made it more popular. And he is one of the main researchers into the subject. And his was an inquiry both based on his personal experience, but this idea that in our unconscious, so if you know, there's sort of our conscious selves, and then there's the subconscious, which is the individual part of ourselves that underlies the conscious mind, and then there's the unconscious, which is sort of underneath that, and it's theorized to be this, the archetypal space. And so what are archetypes? How can they exist? Archetypes seem to be these very basic, primitive sort of notions and ideas that all of humanity share. And so in any culture and throughout history, in any time, all of the people share this world of archetypes, and each of these archetypes is manifested very differently based on your culture. So there's the individual and the surrounding culture that sort of affects how it manifests, but underlying it all, there seems to be this very collective unified world of archetypes that we all share as being human beings. And so this collective unconscious, which when Jung was researching, he came to this conclusion based on his findings. He was looking for a theory, for an idea that could solve all of these seemingly inexplicable, phenomenon. And another example, especially from Jung's personal life, was his premonitions. And so he didn't speak about it for most of his life, but when he was older and sort of more willing to share, he spoke about the fact that before the First World War. I suddenly wasn't sure which one. I think, yeah, it was before the First World War, when he was a young man. He would have these terrible, terrible nightmares. And in the nightmares, the whole world was sort of at war and covered in blood and many people dying. And he had these terrible visions in his dreams. And he was obviously perplexed by them. And for a long time, that could have very well also, had an important part in his position towards dreams and how he dealt with them and treated them. But he sort of didn't get an answer or didn't quite understand what was going on until the war broke out, and he was suddenly sort of faced with this very difficult notion of he had premonitions of this happening. He was been sort of dreaming for years that this sort of thing was going to occur, and what is sort of his responsibility and his place with having this information before and not understanding, just being sort of a bystander and forced to be passive in his knowledge of what's going to come, but inability to do anything. And so this pushed him to really think about what could explain, how could a person have this view of the future that is really not even his personal thing, because he didn't actually, believe, I might be wrong, but I think he didn't actually fight in the war. He certainly wasn't injured or anything, so he didn't experience in the same way, but in his dreams he certainly did. His dreams seemed to take on a species perspective, a more inclusive perspective of humanity as a whole. And this was part of the idea that points towards this sort of underlying feeling that underneath all of the psychology and the psyche and our mental beings, there is this core that binds us all together as a species, that we all share this underlying collective unconscious between us. And indeed, the 100th monkey experiment shows it with animals as well. And with us, there is sort of more evidence in psychology and different experiments that were done showing different examples of this thing. So, okay, but 10:30, not bad. That was a little bit of information. I hope it was understandable. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to ask. It's very quiet in chat today. Archangel Gabriel, great to have you here. Darsico, thank you for joining. Sorry I didn't see you all coming. Hive QA, welcome. A pleasure to have you. How are you all doing? Is it okay so far? Let me know in the comments. Okay, so the idea that we are coming away from, or that I'm trying to sort of present here, when Drunvalo mentions that the Galactic Command decided to construct this Christ consciousness grid around the planet, they were doing so with an understanding of the effect that it would have on our species as a whole. And so, although, as we said, this was supposed to be this is a natural thing that can occur, it's interesting to see the parallel where this event was triggered by a synthetic Merkaba that the Martians had created, and now the the Galactic Command are attempting to rectify the situation once again with a synthetic Christ consciousness grid. And it sort of seems to be fitting because they, complement each other very much. No, it's a pleasure. And so when they decide to do this, they actually sort of start sending out a team of people, not people, as it were, higher beings, but lower than them. And 3 of those beings that are mentioned in the book, and actually some of them that we've heard of before. The first of them was Thoth, who is Drunvalo's, I'll remind, sort of main source for all of this information, and Thoth, for a lot of what we've been talking about so far, lived through it to a certain degree. As he became a multidimensional being, he sort of exited the cycle of life and death, and so he is telling these events to Drunvalo sort of firsthand, as it were. And along with him is another being whom we've mentioned before, the name Ra, who, if you'll recall, when Sitchin talks about, actually correlates Ra to Dumuzi, sorry. And there's an interesting relationship there because, well, this is sort of going to be one of those things again, as we see there are certain discrepancies between the two timelines. And it's my belief that when Drunvalo mentions Ra, this isn't actually the same being who is mentioned by Sitchin as the god of Egypt. And indeed, what makes it very difficult is that a lot of the times different beings would take the same name, or if it was a sort of title, and it becomes very confusing. We can see also in different writings that there are sometimes scholars of the same name, and it's easy to confuse them. So just for our sakes, understanding and purposes, to make it as clear as possible, the Ra that Drunvalo is mentioning is another sort of enlightened being who used to be of a lower level human, and he is sort of joining Thoth with this party of representatives to take part in the construction of the Christ consciousness grid here on Earth. And along with them, there is another character whose name is Araragat. It's a name that I'm actually not familiar with, and Drunvalo doesn't actually mention him again in the book. So we will continue, but he has some of these pieces of information that aren't necessarily, details that aren't necessarily crucial, but he sort of, I think, is relaying the information as I am doing now. But feel free to forget that name. And those, the three of them together, start traveling to different points on the Earth. And the actual work that's being done is that when they reach one of these sort of nodal points where they begin constructing the Christ consciousness grid, they're doing the construction in a higher dimension. And so if you'll remember when we spoke about the beings, the Lemurians creating, the Atlanteans creating Lemuria, the Atlanteans who began to construct it and shape it in the model of a human brain with the two hemispheres, they were doing that work first in the higher dimensions as well. So there's a lot of talk of this now, and we'll come back to it again. But if you're interested, I'll just mention very quickly, Michael Tellinger talks a lot about this energy work in the sense of constructing and using spiritual technology in higher levels of dimensions. So if you're interested in that, we are going to be talking about that more in the coming series, and you can check it out yourselves if you want. But basically, for us to understand, it comes back to the idea of dimensions that we've touched upon many times and will continue. If you think about it, in a way, when two people are sort of talking, especially if there's a serious conversation, a helpful conversation, a sort of encouraging, even therapeutic, using only words and ideas and concepts, that's work that's done in the emotional scale of things, as it were, or on the mental dimension, but not in the physical world as in and of itself. Now, I'm trying to use it as a metaphor. The physical representation would be the sound waves that exit, someone's mouth and hit somebody's ear. But if you look just at those sound waves as physical manifestations, they don't hold the meaning. They don't actually have any value, as we can see on the therapeutic psychological side. So this idea of work being done on a higher dimension and having a physical representation, but that not being the main side of it, I think is an interesting idea that might be hard to wrap our head around. But if we can look at it from a different perspective, another example of that would be a psychedelic experience. For those who have experiences or not, if you see someone who's having a psychedelic experience, it looks very, very bizarre because on the physical side of things, first of all, they're not communicative. They don't really, if they're deep in it, they're not talking, they're not actually looking at something, their consciousness is not in the third dimension right now. And so if you look at it through that prism, it looks very, very strange. They have sort of involuntary movements. They're not moving like normal people. They're not talking. They look very strange. But if you see it, if you could see inside what they're experiencing right now, they're going through this very intense experience on another dimension, another level of reality. So this idea might be more familiar than we could have supposed to begin with. And when the three of them are doing this work, they are not in the same way. They're not just using the mental or the normal bodies that we use, but they are still manipulating energy in higher frequencies, in higher dimensions, and sort of creating this crystalline structure through that. And so a lot of spirit science, the subject that we've been talking about, and the whole idea, an ethereal crystalline structure is something that grows naturally, but it's very bizarre to think of people and, carrying some kind of laser beam, drawing. I don't know how we imagine what it would look like. But it comes down to, and this is obviously the big subject that we keep coming around to, it comes down to sacred geometry and the use of sacred geometry in spirit science and spiritual technologies. And it's something very interesting. We can see this in various examples, that when you manipulate energy a certain way, when you guide energy, when you force it, certain shapes or certain frequencies, etc., it behaves in a certain way. And that's the basis of a lot of technology that we use today and a lot of our science. What we're talking about is really very much the same thing, only with different frequencies and different structures, a different form. But it's still the matter of this energy is around us, is in existence. And if you build a triangular shape, exactly, thank you very much, that's exactly what I was going to say. If you construct a pyramid, that will affect the energy inside and around that structure. No matter what the size is and no matter the material, it will have an effect. And then if you enter into the question of materials and size and physical location, that will also change the outcome and the effect. And a very clear example of this, obviously, is the practice of feng shui. There's actually an Indian practice as well, which I never remember the name of. I apologize. But this is a rather common notion, the fact that the placement of certain things has an effect. To a certain degree, interior design takes this into account. If you think of the flow in the room, sitting somewhere, even sort of the air pathways, the way that the air goes through the room, all of these things affect it. When you design a grow room, a greenhouse, and you want the air to circulate throughout all the places, you have to consider the shape of the room itself. And it's very much the same when it comes to energy as well. So, in fact, oh my gosh, okay, we're nearly out of time. So I will just mention very quickly, we'll finish up on this and then I think we'll be okay. When they were constructing the grid, they were sort of starting out with the energy patterns, and they were mapping the energy that the Earth was sort of exuding already, the ley lines and the Earth's resonance in and of itself, and to sort of map onto that energy structure this crystalline grid, which was made up of triangles and squares, as we mentioned, and those triangles and squares are actually guiding the energy into those certain shapes, which have an effect. Qigong. Qigong. Interesting. Did they talk about? I thought feng shui was part of the the Qi and Qigong philosophy, which is all based on Taoism and the yin and yang, and feng shui is the art of using yin and yang when it comes to structure, placement in an environment, and the design of the structure, sort of a house, etc. That's what I understood. But yeah, please, please correct me if I'm wrong. You mean moving energy? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you hear actual practitioners, Chinese masters talk about Qigong, when I just heard a very lovely excerpt and lecture about it. They say people imagine what is, moving energy. What is qi? If you don't know, qi is the Chinese term for energy, ki in Japanese. Lax, welcome. Great to have you here as well, right for the end, but I'm glad as well. Oh, are you for the next show? That's a lot of people I remember now. When we talk, he says, when you imagine what moving energy is, you might imagine like Doctor Strange and, waving your arms and this ball of fire coming out, etc., etc. But what the Chinese mean by it, part of it, is that within our body we have energy, and this energy is moving. And when you talk, you're moving energy, and when you move your hand or make a fist or jump, you're literally moving energy around, because the qi energy is the manifestation of everything. Every sensation that we have, the 5 senses, and every physical manifestation that we see, material matter, are all expressions of qi. So this is it's a very, very common thing. It's not this sort of magical shooting fireballs from our palms that we often associate, or some of us maybe, with martial arts and Chinese Qigong practitioners. Of course, however, those who are masterful can indeed, I've seen very convincing, and I've believe in I actually studied Kung Fu, and my teacher, we also talked about these things. Some people really can generate heat with their hands, and do incredible things that look magical. But qi itself, at its most basic level, is what is the energy that is in existence, that we are in and of itself. I see. Yeah, you have to subscribe. Rondon's always telling me to remind you. You have to subscribe, Lax, and then you'll get a notification when it goes up. And if you ever miss and you want to go back, you're more than welcome to follow the podcast on the podcast apps. Reminder to all those who are listening live that if you like what you hear and you'd like to share it and have more people be aware of it, and if they're not able to join the live Discord show, they can always look for it on apps. I just added it to Podbean the other day, so I'm now there as well. If you have any apps that I'm not on, please let me know. But yes, subscribe regardless, Lax, because you are on Discord, so it's a shame not to. It is better to be on the live show, I think. And if you are listening to this and you're not subscribed, make sure you do so. Vaccine got scammed. Oh no, with on Discord. I heard. I actually don't know anything about it, but I heard. Anyway, I'll listen in when he talks about it. You don't have to mention it now. Great, nice. A prerequisite for every doctor in China. Yeah, the energy, what is it? The subtle energy system, the body energy system, is not an what do they call it? Alternative, as it is here. It is the medical system that they all sort of use in China. It's part of the traditional medical system that we have. He's not doing a show. Oh no, on Steam. Oh dear. I'm very sorry to hear. Okay, so he's not. So there is no post up this evening. I'm sorry to say. Krim, do you have a show? If I'm already remembering and I'm getting close to the end, Krim, do you have a show tonight? I can't remember if you mentioned it before. If you do, let me know. Worth staying on for that. It's in 2 hours, 3 hours. I can't remember. What time is it? UTC 12, right? No. Anyway, let me know in the comments, Rondon. Thank you. The last one of the year, of course. Wait, is that my last episode as well? No, okay, I have a few. Okay. Will I be able to look at setup yet? Oh dear. Okay. Sorry, I'm just reading through chat to see what the details are. But yes, 10:50? Oh, now it's 10:50. Yeah. Yes, we're just about to wrap up. If you're listening to this, you're more than welcome to, if you're listening at a later date, we're now going to be rambling with chat. So I always like to mention, because the last few minutes, it's tough to really dive into a big subject. Before you go, I just want to let you know, because it isn't very often that I'm so on top of things that we have the next episode lined up, but I happen to know the next episode subject is going to be, and it's an interesting one. We're going to start, and we'll see how far we get, but it's a big one. We're going to start talking about the pyramid. Now, we're not going to get too much into it, because later on in the book, Drunvalo had many experiences in the pyramid, and he talks about it a lot in the function. There's basically a lot to cover as we go through the book. But for now, the next few episodes, we're going to be talking specifically about how it ties into the Christ consciousness grid and the construction process, etc. So that's the next episode. Make sure if you're interested, you catch us then. You'll try and do a small stream, but not 3 hours. Okay, so worth staying up for that. For me, it's staying up because I'm here. I think a lot of people, it'd be like early afternoon. Manly Hall. Just watch this. Oh, Manly Hall, Initiation of the Pyramid. Is it Pyramid Mysteries? I've got in here. I can't actually see the whole way of the map. Initiation of the Pyramids and the Giza Mystery. Oh, I'd like to check it out. There's a lot of info and a lot of people nowadays, specifically, who are sort of offering guided meditation. I not to let anyone down, or I have no idea, but I've just seen some very funny characters, I think, who I'm not sure if everything is exactly as they describe. On that note, I don't know if Drunvalo is telling the truth either, but his description and what he talks about, it's interesting nonetheless. And I mean, I think honestly that when it comes to the pyramids and their sort of significance and function, there's just so much to talk about. I think that it has a lot behind it. You can see just with the the mathematics, the description, the actual details in the structure, that it already has so much within it. So, I'm not claiming in any way to know all that there is, but it'd be interesting. I love Manly P. Hall. He's usually very, very good. So I will definitely check that out. Thank you, Rondon. I'll have a look afterwards. Okay. Oh, yeah. You have to play it if you have it. What do you mean? Are you talking to me? No, I don't think so. Oh, Crimps. I thought that was you talking. Okay. Just wanted to make sure. You're talking in chat, so I wasn't sure if it's set for me. So yeah, that's basically, sorry about all that blabbering. That is what we're going to be talking about next week. We're going to be talking about Thoth's role in the pyramid, and the pyramid's both importance in the construction of the consciousness grid, and indeed the function of the pyramid in general, what part of it was all about. So make sure you stay tuned for that next week. For now, how do you feel about the show today? It's hard for me to tell. Sometimes when I talk too quickly, I feel like it might be a little more all over the place, and I sometimes want to try and get through everything, so I sort of pick up the pace. But was it a good pace for you guys? Do you feel like you followed what we talked about, and it was understandable? I think that's my biggest fear when it comes to the podcast in general. It's always a question of sort of narrowing down and deciding like what part to include and what part to exclude, etc., etc. So it's tough. Yeah, it's a lot to take in. I agree. Well, the good thing is, you see, now you told me the truth, and I'm going to qualify. But no, but the good thing is that a lot of these subjects we're going to be touching on again. The Christ consciousness and the Christ consciousness grid are sort of things that Drunvalo has been mentioning also throughout with the different levels of consciousness. So it's a lot to take in. It's a lot of details, but it's also a story that's sort of taking place over a long period of time. So we're going to be coming back and back to it again. And there is a lot of jumping all over the place. But it's okay. You can always, re-listen to the episode or just tune in next week and start afresh. Doesn't really matter, does it? No, but I'm... I hope you get something out of it nonetheless, one way or another. It's, I feel... For me personally, I was just looking the other day because I uploaded to Podbean again, the first few episodes, and seeing where the podcast started out as being, well, it was basically just about the eco-village and the project and what we want to do and the whole theory sort of behind it. And it's interesting because I had a friend sort of ask me about the podcast and what happened, and I had to word it for myself what made me sort of change directions and go into all of this. And I do stand behind it. I do think that this information, Drunvalo, Sitchin, Tellinger, is important, especially today, and especially if people haven't heard of it. I do think that it's a very, very pertinent information to humanity as a whole right now in the world. So yes, I hope you enjoyed. Oh, how is I can see. It's a good pace, but I'm not completely unfamiliar to what you talk about. I know, it's tough to also hit a balance between people who are very familiar and know a lot, and people who have never heard it ever, and then, I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, well, so you know what, listen to the show, and then go onto Wikipedia afterwards for the things that I don't talk about enough, because, yeah. Oh, good. I'm glad. Yeah, and over time, we'll sort of. I think it's always the case. When I was learning these things, also, or reading about it, or whatever, you first come across it, and everything is new, or it's a ton of information, and you have no concept to really put it into place. You have no sort of ability to map it all together. And then it's sort of becoming more and more familiar and hearing about it more and more and having these ideas recur. And then over time, it sort of manages to sit in more clearly. So there is also the fact that it would be, for subjects like ley lines that you've never heard of before, it's a big subject to sort of wrap our head around. So it definitely takes time, I think, for everyone that I've spoken to who is on this journey. So I'm glad you're on it with me. I have to say, I really do appreciate each and every one of you who takes the time and joins and writes in chat and listens. It's really amazing. Yes, and sorry, Rhonda, how's the eco-village? It's going well. We've actually, there's a lot of developments. We have our first possible member who's staying on the land now with us, and so that's very exciting in and of itself. And we are in the process still of building the teepee. It's taking a long time. There's just so much going on. It's nice to have the podcast to sort of have that anchor once a week where I can tune out of all of the assignments and goals that we have. But it's coming together just very, very slowly. And coronavirus is a huge setback as well, as it were. Sort of, everything seems to be going much more slowly now, I think, in the world. We'll see what 2021 will be like. I've heard many things in both directions. Because it seems to be the last few years, every year we've said, wow, that was a tough year. I bet next year will be a bit better. And then 2020 came to to knock the ball out of the park. So we'll see. We're coming up. Monday is the winter solstice, to remind you all. So I don't know if you're into it before Christmas, but yeah, we're going to be celebrating on the land, hopefully. So yeah, if you are into that, enjoy. Happy solstice, Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah, whatever you celebrate and enjoy doing. And I can see we're just about out of time. So I've been Olev. I will leave you here. And as always, I'm, 2021, the third act. Jesus. Well, we'll wait and see. Absolutely. But until
we have
then...
to talk about...
Oh, sorry. That was the wrong button. I've been Olev. It's been a pleasure as usual, and I hope you join me all next week for another episode. Until then, have a great one. Bye.